In the darkness of March 21, 1943, Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock commanded U-96 as it surfaced in the Bay of Biscay, coordinates placing it at 47 degrees north latitude and 6 degrees west longitude. The submarine's diesel engines roared to life, performing the essential nightly ritual of recharging the vessel's battery banks, a procedure that had kept German submarines operational since the war's opening days. Posted lookouts swept their Zeiss optical instruments across the horizon, searching for the distinctive exhaust trails that would betray approaching enemy aircraft. Their vigil revealed nothing unusual. The crude Metox radar warning receiver, its cross-shaped antenna earning it the nickname Biscay Cross among the crew, maintained its silence. Unknown to those aboard U-96, their sense of security was a dangerous illusion. Approximately 7 nautical miles distant, beyond the range of human vision in the moonless night, a Wellington bomber from Royal Air Force Coastal Command had already established a tracking lock using its Type 271 Centimetric radar system. The German submariners possessed merely 12 seconds before the aircraft would reach attack position with its deadly cargo of depth charges. The technological shield, they believed, protected them. The assumption that radar emissions could be intercepted before aircraft arrived had become obsolete through a singular leap in Allied technology. British forces had fundamentally altered the rules of naval aerial combat without announcement or warning, and German submarine crews would perish by the hundreds before their high command comprehended what had occurred. This narrative explores how a mere 10-centimeter wavelength difference destroyed Germany's most potent strategic naval weapon, and how the men who operated beneath the waves discovered, far too late, that oceanic darkness no longer provided refuge. Between May 1943 and May 1944, the Kriegsmarine lost 245 U-boats. The majority of crews never understood the source of their destruction. They simply vanished between routine radio transmissions and eternal silence. Throughout spring 1943, every U-boat commander grappled with a haunting mystery concerning how Allied aircraft were locating submarines in complete darkness. The Metox detection systems functioned flawlessly. They had successfully identified ASV Mark II radar emissions since their introduction in August 1942. Submarine crews religiously monitored these receivers, executing immediate crash dives when the characteristic warning tone indicated radar illumination. This defensive doctrine had proven effective for 8 months, with survival rates for vessels crossing the Bay of Biscay actually improving. Then March 1943 arrived, and U-boats began dying in darkness. No Metox warning preceded these attacks. No visual contact with aircraft occurred beforehand. Catastrophic assaults materialized from aircraft that appeared without prelude. Crews who survived reported an identical, bewildering pattern, wherein submarines running surfaced under excellent visibility conditions, with alert lookouts posted and functional Metox detectors showing no contacts. Then suddenly, aircraft overhead releasing depth charges or bombs before the diving alarm could even sound. These attacks arrived with such velocity that most boats never achieved full submersion. Aircraft caught them during the vulnerable transition phase with conning tower hatches still unsealed, diesel engines still engaged, and compressed air venting as ballast tanks flooded. The depth charges detonated alongside partially submerged hulls, fracturing pressure hulls and condemning 50 men to deaths measured in seconds rather than the prolonged agony of a disabled boat sinking slowly beyond its crush. Depth. To comprehend the catastrophe that overwhelmed the U-boat force in 1943, one must first understand the operational philosophy that had transformed German submarines into history's most effective commerce raiders. The U-boat was not, despite popular imagination, primarily a submerged vessel. It was a surface raider capable of submergence when threatened. This distinction was fundamental to every aspect of U-boat design, crew training, and tactical deployment. The Type 7C U-boat, representing the backbone of Germany's submarine fleet with 703 examples constructed during the war, operated approximately 90% of its mission time on the surface. This wasn't preference but necessity, dictated by physics and engineering constraints. The twin-man diesel engines, generating 2,800 brake horsepower, could propel the vessel to 17 knots surface speed, while simultaneously charging the massive battery banks powering electric motors for submerged operations. Underwater, those same electric motors could manage only 7.5 knots maximum speed for approximately 80 nautical miles before battery exhaustion forced surfacing. These performance parameters meant a U-boat's effective operational radius, its ability to reach distant hunting grounds and return to base, depended entirely on surface running capability. A boat operating in the mid-Atlantic, 1,000 miles from its French base, needed to spend the vast majority of its patrol surfaced simply to position itself where merchant convoys might be intercepted. Submergence was a defensive measure, a temporary refuge from aircraft or surface escorts, not a normal cruising mode. This operational reality shaped every aspect of U-boat tactics. Boats hunted on the surface where lookouts with excellent optics could detect convoy smoke at 20 miles distance. They attacked on the surface whenever possible, where speed and maneuverability allowed multiple torpedo shots and rapid repositioning. They raced on the surface to intercept positions radioed by U-boat, headquarters in Lorient, or by other boats already in contact with convoys. The night surface attack had evolved through 3 years of combat into a precise tactical system. U-boats would shadow convoys during daylight hours from beyond visual range, tracking by hydrophone and periodic periscope observations. After sunset, they would surface and race ahead of the convoy, positioning themselves for night surface attacks that exploited the U-boat's low silhouette against the dark ocean. British escorts, their radar unable to distinguish surface submarines from wave clutter and their sonar useless against surface targets, found these attacks nearly impossible to counter. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm and later commander-in-chief of the entire Kriegsmarine, built his entire strategic concept around night surface attacks. His doctrine called for wolfpack tactics, groups of 15 to 20 boats concentrating against single convoys, all attacking on the surface in coordinated waves that overwhelmed escort defenses through sheer numbers. This system nearly severed Britain's Atlantic lifeline in 1942, sinking over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The key to survival in this surface warfare doctrine was early warning of air attack. U-boats were helpless against aircraft when caught on the surface. The deck gun, an 80mm weapon effective against merchant ships, proved useless against aircraft approaching at 150 mph from above. The boat's only defense was crash diving, flooding tanks and submerging before aircraft could close to attack range. A well-trained crew could clear the bridge and submerge to periscope depth in 30 seconds, reaching safe depth of 60 feet in 45 seconds. But this defense required warning. Lookouts needed to spot aircraft at sufficient distance, or radar detectors needed to sense radar emissions before aircraft reached attack range. This requirement drove German radar detector development and deployment. The first German radar detector, called Metox after its French manufacturer, entered U-boat service in August 1942. The device was crude by later standards. A simple receiver tuned to detect the 1.5-meter wavelength emissions of British ASV Mark II radar, the standard system equipping Royal Air Force Coastal Command aircraft. The receiving antenna, a distinctive cross-shaped configuration mounted on a wooden pole that could be raised from the conning tower, earned the nickname Biscay Cross from U-boat crews who first employed it during Bay of Biscay transits. Metox never represented sophisticated technology. The device detected radar illumination, but provided no directional information and no range estimate. When the receiver detected ASV Mark II emissions, it simply produced an audio tone in headphones worn by a dedicated operator stationed in the control room. The tone's intensity increased as the transmitting aircraft approached, giving the operator a crude sense of whether the threat was closing or receding. That was all. No display, no sophisticated processing, just a tone that meant one thing: dive immediately. Despite this simplicity, Metox proved remarkably effective. ASV Mark II radar, operating at 1.5-meter wavelength, could detect a surfaced U-boat at approximately 12 miles under optimal conditions. The Metox receiver, being passive and thus not limited by the need to receive reflected signals, could detect ASV Mark II transmissions at approximately 20 to 30 miles, depending on atmospheric conditions and aircraft altitude. This detection range advantage provided U-boat crews 10 to 15 minutes of warning, ample time to crash dive and evade. The psychological impact of Metox exceeded its tactical value. For the first time since aircraft had become a significant anti-submarine threat, U-boat crews possessed a defense that didn't rely solely on human eyesight. Lookouts, regardless of alertness, could be defeated by clouds, haze, or simple human fallibility. Metox was tireless, scanning continuously, detecting electromagnetic emissions invisible to human senses. Crews learned to trust the device absolutely. When Metox remained silent, they believed themselves safe from air attack. This belief became doctrine. By late 1942, U-boat standing orders required continuous Metox monitoring whenever surfaced. If the detector warned of radar emissions, the boat dove immediately. No exceptions. If Metox remained silent, boats could remain surfaced even in areas of heavy air patrol, confident that any radar-equipped aircraft would trigger the detector before reaching attack range. Survival statistics supported this confidence. U-boat losses to aircraft in the Bay of Biscay, previously a killing ground where Coastal Command had enjoyed easy victories against transit submarines, declined markedly after Metox introduction. Donitz himself endorsed this confidence. In December 1942, he informed U-boat commanders that Metox had robbed the enemy of his advantage in radar location. Intelligence reports from captured British aircrews confirmed that RAF Coastal Command was indeed equipped primarily with ASV Mark II radar. The strategic picture seemed clear in that Germany had defeated British radar through the simple expedient of detecting it before it could guide effective attacks. The technology that would destroy U-boat operational security developed not through dramatic breakthrough, but through patient refinement of principles already understood. British radar research had begun earnestly in 1935, when Robert Watson Watt demonstrated that radio waves could detect aircraft at meaningful ranges. By 1939, Britain possessed the Chain Home Early Warning System, a network of coastal radar stations, operating at wavelengths between 10 and 13 meters that could detect incoming German bomber formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. But these long wavelength radars, while effective for detecting large aircraft formations, lacked the resolution necessary for anti-submarine warfare. The physics were unforgiving in that radar resolution. The ability to distinguish small objects from background clutter depended directly on wavelength. Longer wavelengths produced broader, less defined returns. At 1.5 meters, the wavelength of ASV Mark II radar, a surfaced U-boat produced a radar return barely distinguishable from wave clutter, detectable only under calm seas and with skilled operator interpretation. What British research required was radar operating at much shorter wavelengths, ideally 10 centimeters or less, where the conning tower of a surfaced U-boat would produce a clear, unmistakable return even in moderate seas. The challenge was generating sufficient power at these high frequencies. Conventional vacuum tubes, the heart of all radio and radar equipment, became inefficient at very high frequencies. The power levels required for effective radar, thousands of watts of pulsed energy, seemed beyond Centimetric technology's capabilities. The solution emerged from an unexpected quarter. In February 1940, two physicists at Birmingham University, John Randall and Harry Boot, developed a device called the Cavity Magnetron. Unlike conventional vacuum tubes generating radio frequency, power through electron beams in linear paths, the Cavity Magnetron used a circular chamber with precisely machined cavities where electrons, forced into circular paths by powerful magnets, generated electromagnetic oscillations at very high frequencies. The device was elegant in concept and, once manufacturing challenges were solved, relatively simple to produce. The first operational Cavity Magnetron tested in late 1940 generated 10 kilowatts of pulsed power at 10 centimeter wavelength. This was revolutionary. Previous attempts at centimetric radar had struggled to generate even hundreds of watts. 10 kilowatts provided more than sufficient power for effective maritime patrol radar. By autumn 1940, British researchers had installed prototype Centimetric radar in test aircraft and confirmed what theory predicted in that surface submarines appeared on displays as clear, unmistakable contacts even in rough seas. The operational version, designated Type 271 radar, entered production in early 1941. The complete system weighed 270 pounds, dramatically lighter than ASV Mark II's bulk. The rotating antenna, mounted in a streamlined radome beneath the aircraft's fuselage, scanned continuously while the transmitter pulsed electromagnetic energy at 9.7 centimeter wavelength. Returns appeared on a plan position indicator display. a circular cathode ray tube where the operator could see a map-like view of everything around the aircraft out to maximum detection range. Maximum detection range, for a surfaced U-boat under optimal conditions, was 7 miles. Less than ASV Mark the Sen's 12-mile range, but Type 271 offered something infinitely more valuable, which was reliability. Where ASV Mark Thermo's returns disappeared in rough seas, or depended on operator skill to distinguish submarines from wave clutter, Type 271 presented clear contacts regardless of sea state. The conning tower of a Type 7 Sea U-boat produced an unmistakable bright return on the display, easily distinguished from the dimmer clutter of wave returns. The tactical implications were profound. Aircraft equipped with Type 271 could detect surfaced U-boats at 7 miles, close to visual range in darkness, approach at 150 meters per hour, and be overhead in approximately 3 minutes. If the aircraft maintained strict radio silence and approached from the submarine's stern quarter, where lookout coverage was weakest, the first warning might be the sound of aircraft engines overhead, audible only seconds before attack. But the technology's true revolutionary characteristic was invisibility to German radar detectors. Metox was designed to detect 1.5-meter wavelength transmissions from ASV Mark the radar. The receiver's circuitry, antenna dimensions, and tuning were all optimized for this specific frequency band. Type 271's 9.7 centimeter wavelength was 15 times higher in frequency, falling completely outside Metox's detection range. To a Metox receiver, Type 271 might as well not exist. An aircraft could illuminate a U-boat continuously with Type 271 radar, while the boat's Metox detector remained absolutely silent, reporting no threat. British operational security regarding Type 271 was comprehensive. Aircraft equipped with the new radar were forbidden from using it over land, where a crashed aircraft might allow Germans to recover the technology. Aircrews received explicit orders never to discuss the radar's existence, even in general terms. If forced to ditch or bail out, radar operators were instructed to destroy the magnetron specifically before abandoning aircraft. The British code name for the operation, introducing Type 271 equipped aircraft, was Cork, reflecting the intention to seal off the Bay of Biscay to U-boat transit. The first aircraft equipped with operational Type 271 began Bay of Biscay patrols in March 1943. German U-boat headquarters had no idea the rules had changed. The slaughter commenced on March 2, 1943. U-275, a Type 7 boat commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Helmuth Bork, was running surfaced in the Bay of Biscay, en route to operations in the North Atlantic. The night was moonless but clear, with excellent visibility. 4 lookouts scanned the darkness methodically, searching their assigned sectors. In the control room, a dedicated operator monitored the Metox detector, headphones secured, watching the crude meter that would indicate radar illumination. The detector remained silent. At 2200 hours, a Wellington bomber from RAF Squadron 172, equipped with Type 271 radar and Lee light, acquired U-275 at 6 miles range. The aircraft commander, Wing Commander Jefferson Greswell, noted the clear contact on his planned position indicator and began his approach run, maintaining altitude and using radar to track the submarine while remaining invisible in the darkness. The Metox detector aboard U-275 continued reporting no threat. At 1 mile range, Greswell descended to attack altitude and activated the Lee light, a 24-inch naval searchlight mounted in the Wellington's belly, capable of illuminating targets at 1 mile with 20 million candle power. The sudden appearance of blinding light shocked U-275's bridge watch. Bork screamed the alarm for crash dive, but the Wellington was already overhead, releasing 6 depth charges in a perfect straddle pattern. The explosions detonated as U-275's, bow dipped beneath the surface, conning tower still exposed, diesel engines still engaged. The pressure hull fractured in 3 places. Water flooded into the control room through the open conning tower hatch before anyone could secure it. The boat sank in under 1 minute. There were no survivors from the crew of 46. The entire action, from radar contact to sinking, lasted 4 minutes. The Metox detector never registered a warning. This pattern repeated with horrifying regularity throughout March and April 1943. U-167 was caught surfaced on March 17th, attacked without Metox warning, and sank with all hands. U-469 on April 20th met the same circumstances with 45 dead. U-753 on May 30th was surprised by aircraft despite clear conditions and alert lookouts, lost with 50 crew. The reports from boats that survived these attacks shared consistent details involving aircraft appearing without warning despite functional Metox detectors. Attacks executed with such speed that crash diving offered no safety, and lee light illumination occurring at ranges where lookouts should have seen the approaching aircraft but reported nothing until the light activated. The conclusion was inescapable but incomprehensible to German tactical doctrine in that Allied aircraft were somehow detecting and tracking U-boats without triggering Metox warnings. U-boat headquarters initially resisted the obvious conclusion. On March 21st, Donitz issued orders requiring continuous Metox monitoring and immediate diving on any warning, as if the problem were crew carelessness rather than technological obsolescence. When boats continued dying despite strict adherence to these procedures, headquarters theorized that Metox emissions themselves might somehow be detectable, that Germany's own radar detector was betraying U-boats to Allied direction-finding equipment. This theory was nonsense, as Metox was a passive receiver producing no detectable emissions, but it revealed headquarters' desperate inability to accept that British radar technology had leaped beyond German countermeasures. Some commanders reached the correct conclusion independently. Korvettenkapitän Peter Kremer, commanding U-163, noted in his war diary after a near-miss attack in April that aircraft appeared without Metox warning. This had happened too frequently to be explained by equipment failure, and he must conclude the enemy possessed radar they could not detect, recommending extreme caution and immediate diving on any aircraft sighting, regardless of Metox status. But Kremer's conclusion, though correct, offered no tactical solution. If Allied aircraft could detect U-boats beyond visual range using undetectable radar, then the fundamental doctrine of surface operations had become suicidal. U-boats needed to surface to charge batteries, transit at efficient speeds, and hunt effectively. If surface operations invited undetectable air attack, then U-boats lost their primary operational advantage. The boats would become true submarines, confined underwater, limited to battery-powered operations that reduced effective range to uselessness. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In March 1943, Coastal Command sank 15 U-boats. In April, 16 U-boats. In May, the slaughter peaked at 41 U-boats, lost to all causes with air attack accounting for the majority. The Bay of Biscay, which U-boats had to cross to reach Atlantic hunting grounds, became known among crews as the Valley of Death. The odds of surviving a bay transit were dropping toward 50%. The first physical evidence of British centimetric radar reached German hands on June 1, 1943, when an RAF Coastal Command Sunderland flying boat equipped with ASV Mark III radar, a maritime patrol variant similar to Type 271, was forced down off Norway. German recovery teams salvaged the radar equipment and transported it to Berlin for analysis. Kriegsmarine technical experts examined the Cavity Magnetron at the heart of the system and confronted their fundamental miscalculation. The British had not merely developed centimetric radar, they had solved the manufacturing challenges that German physicists had declared insurmountable. The Cavity Magnetron was elegant, relatively simple, and clearly in mass production. The implications were catastrophic. Every assumption underlying U-boat tactical doctrine, every calculation of relative advantage in the anti-submarine war, had been based on the premise that radar detectors would provide adequate warning of air attack. That premise was now demonstrably false. German responses came too late and proved inadequate. Naxos, the German centimetric radar detector, didn't enter service until October 1943, and even then only in limited quantities. The device could detect Type 271 emissions, but its sensitivity was poor, typically providing only 2 to 3 miles warning, insufficient for crash diving before aircraft reached attack position. By the time Naxos equipped most operational U-boats in early 1944, the strategic damage was irreversible. The psychological impact on U-boat crews exceeded even the staggering casualty figures. Submariners had accepted extraordinary risks as part of their service, i.e., 75% casualty rate over the course of the war with 30,000 dead from 40,000. Men who served in U-boats demonstrated their willingness to face death. But those risks had always come with the assumption that skill, vigilance, and proper equipment could provide some measure of control over one's fate. Type 271 removed that assumption. A U-boat commander could follow every procedure perfectly, maintain alert lookouts, monitor radar detectors continuously, and still die without warning because the enemy possessed technology against which German equipment offered no defense. The randomness was psychologically devastating. Survivors reported feeling hunted by an invisible enemy, unable to trust the darkness that had once protected them, unable to believe their detection equipment even when it showed all clear. Oberbootsman Heinrich Lehmann, a senior enlisted man aboard U-224, described the psychological state in his memoir, noting they knew the British could see them when they could not see the British. Every moment on the surface became an exercise in controlled terror. One waited for the sudden flare of the lee light, the scream of aircraft engines overhead, the crash of depth charges. The waiting was worse than combat because at least in combat one could fight back. Against the radar, they had nothing. The operational consequences forced dramatic changes in U-boat tactics. Donitz ordered boats to transit the Bay of Biscay submerged during daylight, surfacing only at night for battery charging, and even then only for minimum necessary time. This reduced transit speeds dramatically and cut into operational time in hunting areas. Boats that previously spent 20 days on station in the North Atlantic found themselves spending 10 days in transit and only 10 days hunting, cutting effectiveness in half. More fundamentally, the night surface attack, the tactical centerpiece of Wolfpack doctrine, became increasingly hazardous. Allied convoys, now escorted by escort carriers providing continuous air cover, could vector aircraft to surfaced U-boats using Type 271 radar. The concentration of U-boats that made Wolfpack attacks effective also made them vulnerable to concentrated air attack. By autumn 1943, Donitz was withdrawing U-boats from the North Atlantic entirely, conceding the battle for the convoy routes. The strategic implications reached beyond tactical defeats. U-boats had been Germany's primary means of striking at Allied logistics, attempting to sever the supply lines sustaining Britain and supporting the eventual invasion of Europe. Average monthly Allied shipping losses fell from over 600,000 tons in early 1943 to under 200,000 tons by year's end. The U-boat arm, which had nearly starved Britain into submission in 1942, had been neutralized as a strategic threat. The German response to Type 271 radar revealed the fundamental asymmetry between Allied and Axis technological development in the war's latter years. While Britain could deploy revolutionary radar systems across hundreds of aircraft within months, Germany struggled to produce even basic countermeasures in meaningful quantities. This disparity reflected not merely technical capability, but the crushing weight of strategic resource allocation in a losing war. Naxos, the German Centimetric radar detector, exemplified these limitations. Development began immediately. After the captured Sunderland provided proof of British Centimetric radar capabilities in June 1943, German engineers understood the physics perfectly and designed a functional detector within weeks. But production proved agonizingly slow. Vacuum tube shortages, competing demands from Luftwaffe night fighter programs, and Allied bombing of German electronics factories meant that Naxos sets trickled to operational U-boats at a rate of perhaps 20 units monthly through late 1943. The technological legacy proved more straightforward. The Cavity Magnetron, developed in British laboratories and deployed in Type 271 radar, became after the war the heart of microwave technology. The same principles that had detected U-boats at 7 miles would eventually enable microwave ovens, satellite communications, and modern radar systems. The physicists who developed centimetric radar couldn't have imagined that their wartime improvisation would become foundational to post-war consumer technology. But the connection was direct and profound. Return now to that March night in 1943 with Captain Lieutenant Lehmann Willenbrock on U-96's bridge, breathing salt air, watching darkness, believing himself safe because the Metox detector remained silent. 7 miles away, electromagnetic pulses at 9.7 centimeter wavelength were reflecting off his conning tower, painting a clear, bright return on a cathode ray tube display that he didn't know existed. The aircraft commander was already beginning his approach run. Lehmann Willenbrock had perhaps 12 seconds of life remaining before depth charges detonated alongside his boat. He survived through circumstances that remain unclear even in historical records. Perhaps the depth charges malfunctioned. Perhaps the aircraft's bomb release mechanism failed. Perhaps simple luck intervened. But thousands of his fellow submariners, in identical circumstances, didn't survive. They died believing their detection equipment was reliable, that the silence of their radar detectors meant safety, that they had taken every reasonable precaution. They died never understanding what killed them. This gap between perceived safety and actual vulnerability defines the U-boat experience in the war's latter years. German submariners weren't fighting merely against Allied escorts or aircraft, but against the fundamental disadvantage of technological obsolescence. They carried equipment designed to detect yesterday's threats while facing tomorrow's capabilities. The resulting mismatch was measured in thousands of lives lost to an enemy they literally couldn't see. The broader lesson transcends naval warfare. U-boat's defeat demonstrates how technological surprise can invalidate established doctrine instantly. German naval planning in 1942, based on careful analysis of Allied capabilities and extensive combat experience, became worthless in weeks once Type 271 radar deployment began. Every tactical assumption, every operational procedure, every confidence in detection equipment was suddenly invalid. The boats continued operating under obsolete assumptions because headquarters couldn't believe initially that British technology had leaped so far ahead. This institutional resistance to accepting unwelcome technological reality cost lives that might have been saved by earlier tactical adaptation. Had Dönitz immediately ordered all boats to remain submerged in high-risk transit areas upon receiving the first reports of attacks without Metox warning, casualties in spring 1943 might have been lower. Instead, headquarters insisted the problem was crew carelessness or equipment failure, refusing to accept that Allied technology had surpassed German countermeasures until physical evidence from capture. The institutional response to declining effectiveness and mounting casualties in the U-boat force revealed the tensions and contradictions inherent in military organizations fighting losing wars. Senior leadership, including Dönitz, maintained public positions of confidence and determination, while privately understanding that submarine operations had become essentially futile. Junior officers and enlisted men maintained discipline and continued executing orders while privately convinced of the hopelessness of their situation. The gap between public rhetoric and private understanding created an atmosphere of cynicism and resignation that pervaded the force. Propaganda efforts to maintain U-boat morale became increasingly disconnected from operational reality. Official naval publications continued celebrating individual successes and portraying submarine service as elite warfare, even as casualty rates reached catastrophic levels. The contrast between propaganda narratives and lived experience became so extreme that propaganda actually undermined morale rather than supporting it, because the obvious dishonesty of official accounts destroyed credibility more effectively than any Allied effort could have. The few genuine successes that U-boats achieved during 1944 and 1945 received disproportionate attention and celebration precisely because they had become so rare. When U-482 successfully penetrated convoy defenses and sank 4 merchant vessels in September 1944, the action was trumpeted as evidence that German submarines remained formidable despite all evidence to the contrary. The need to celebrate such isolated successes revealed how desperate the situation had become. In 1942, sinking 4 merchant vessels in a single action would have been routine and unremarkable. The final months of the U-boat war, from January through May 1945, descended into a surreal continuation of operations that everyone involved understood served no rational purpose. Allied forces were advancing into Germany from all directions, the Nazi regime was collapsing, and final defeat was manifestly imminent. Yet U-boats continued departing on patrol, continued attempting to attack Allied shipping, and continued dying in actions that could not possibly affect the war's outcome. The motivations for these final operations varied among participants. Some crews remained genuinely committed to Nazi ideology and believed that continued resistance served honor even in hopeless circumstances. Others operated from simple military discipline and the belief that following orders was a soldier's fundamental duty, regardless of strategic context. Still others continued because the alternative, surrendering or refusing orders, seemed even more dangerous than continuing operations, given the likely response from Nazi authorities to any suggestion of defection or mutiny. The physical evidence of U-boat operations during this terminal phase shows the progressive degradation of the force's material condition. Boats that departed on patrol in early 1945 did so with incomplete spare parts inventories, marginally functional equipment, and in some cases insufficient fuel for a complete patrol, with the expectation that they would either be destroyed before fuel became critical or that Allied advances would capture the French ports they were based from, making return impossible anyway. The end came with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. Dönitz, who had assumed leadership of the German state following Hitler's suicide, ordered all U-boats to cease operations and surface, transmitting their positions to Allied forces for surrender. The vast majority of boats still at sea complied, though a handful of commanders chose to scuttle their vessels rather than surrender them. The final accounting of the U-boat war reveals its extraordinary human cost. Of approximately 39,000 men who served in German U-boats during World War II, roughly 28,000 died in action or from other causes, a 72% fatality rate unmatched by any other military service. The Type 7C U-boats that formed the backbone of the force throughout the war suffered particularly catastrophic losses, with over 550 of the 703 boats built lost to enemy action, accidents, or scuttling. The strategic assessment of the U-boat campaign's overall impact remains contested among military historians. The submarines did impose significant costs on Allied maritime operations, sinking roughly 2,800 merchant vessels and numerous warships throughout the war. The requirement to construct massive numbers of escort vessels, patrol aircraft, and supporting infrastructure to counter the U-boat threat diverted Allied resources that could have been deployed elsewhere. However, the U-boat campaign ultimately failed in its strategic objective of severing Allied maritime logistics and starving Britain into submission. Allied shipbuilding capacity, particularly American mass production of Liberty ships, outpaced losses even during the worst periods of 1942. The defeat of the U-boat threat by mid-1943, accomplished primarily through technological superiority, including centimetric radar, ensured that Allied preparations for invading Europe could proceed without the maritime supply constraints that German strategy had sought to impose. The human experience of serving in U-boats during the period when centimetric radar destroyed German tactical advantages remains one of the war's most psychologically complex narratives. These men operated sophisticated technology, received extensive training, and served in a military organization that emphasized elite status and professional competence. They did everything their training and doctrine prescribed, maintained their equipment properly, executed procedures correctly, and still died in overwhelming numbers because their adversaries possessed technological capabilities they couldn't counter. The arbitrariness of survival created particular psychological burdens for those who did return. Why had they lived when so many comrades died? What merit or skill had they possessed that others lacked? The answer in most cases was simply luck. They had happened to surface to charge batteries during periods when no Allied aircraft were in the vicinity, or they had been assigned to boats whose commanders were slightly more cautious, or random chance had intervened in any of 1,000 small ways that determined outcomes in confused, rapid combat engagements. This randomness denied survivors the psychological comfort of believing their survival reflected superior skill or judgment. They had been no more competent than the men who died, they had simply been luckier. This realization created a form of survivor guilt particularly difficult to process, because it offered no framework for understanding survival as earned or meaningful, rather than merely arbitrary. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, who commanded U-96 through multiple patrols and survived the war, lived until 1986 and gave occasional interviews about his experiences. In his final years, when asked about the war, he reportedly focused not on victories or tactical achievements, but on the men who didn't return, particularly those who died during spring 1943, when attacks began without warning. His consistent message was that these men had died not because they failed as warriors, but because they fought with obsolete tools against an enemy they couldn't detect. This assessment captures the essential tragedy of the U-boat experience during 1943-1945. The submariners themselves were as skilled, brave, and professionally competent as any military force in history. Their failure was not personal but systemic. They operated within a strategic and technological framework that had been superseded by enemy innovation. No amount of courage or skill could compensate for fighting with detection equipment designed for yesterday's threats while facing tomorrow's capabilities. The broader historical significance of the U-boat's defeat through centimetric radar extends beyond the specific context of World War II submarine warfare. The episode demonstrates how rapidly technological innovation can invalidate established military doctrines, and how difficult it is for institutions to recognize and adapt to such changes in real time. German naval leadership wasn't stupid or incompetent. They simply couldn't believe initially that British technology had advanced as far as it had, and by the time conclusive evidence forced recognition, the strategic damage was done. This pattern, technological surprise creating temporary decisive, advantage until countermeasures are developed, would characterize much of the Cold War military competition and continues, characterizing military technological development today. The lesson of Type 271 radar and the U-boats is not that one side was brilliant and the other foolish, but rather that technological edges can be decisive, and that recognizing when such edges have shifted is extraordinarily difficult in the fog of ongoing operations. For the men who served in U-boats, the technical details of centimetric radar wavelengths and cavity magnetrons were abstractions. Their experience was simpler and more immediate. They lived with the constant awareness that enemy aircraft could see them when they couldn't see the aircraft, that their detection equipment offered no protection, and that each moment spent on the surface might be their last. This grinding anxiety, sustained over weeks or months of patrol, under conditions of extreme discomfort and deprivation, while watching casualty rates climb steadily higher, constituted perhaps the purest form of psychological warfare, using technological superiority to create an environment of inescapable vulnerability that destroyed morale as effectively as it destroyed lives.